On Mother's Day, my son sent me a gift box and I opened it with joy, expecting flowers. But inside was a notice that he had sold the house I was living in and was giving me 2 weeks to leave. I sat in the empty living room, feeling the walls colder than I had ever known them to be. He believed that moving in with his in-laws and buying into their hotel chain would secure his future. What he never imagined was that I already owned it all, and the day he found out would change everything. It was early May, and the air in Charleston carried that faint salt smell that slips in from the harbour before the day really wakes up. I was sitting on the back porch with a mug of jasmine tea, the same brand I have bought for decades, watching the light spill across the yard. At 71, my mornings had a rhythm I did not break. I liked starting the day slowly, letting the sun and the sound of gulls remind me that life could still be steady, even when people were not. I had called my son Austin the day before to remind him that Mother's Day was coming up. He picked up on the third ring, voice brisk, said he was busy with meetings at the hotel. There was no warmth in his tone, just a clipped promise to call me soon. I told myself not to take it to heart. Life with grown children is not the same as it is with young ones. You learn to accept smaller moments, fewer calls, and the space between them. That morning, I moved through the kitchen, wiping the counter, folding a dish towel, the kind of small tasks that keep your hands moving when your mind wants to drift somewhere else. The sunlight was streaming through the lace curtains, landing on the photo of my late husband in his navy blazer, smiling like he always did at the start of a trip. I touched the frame lightly, a habit I never explained to anyone. When the doorbell rang, I thought it might be the neighbour or a package from the grocery service. Instead, there was a small parcel on the mat, plain brown paper, my name written in Austin's handwriting. No card, no bright wrapping, nothing that hinted at celebration. I carried it inside, setting it on the table. I didn't open it right away. I poured another cup of tea, glanced around at the tidy living room, the neat shelves, the rug my husband and I picked out 20 years ago. Then I slid my finger under the tape and lifted the lid. Inside was no ribbon, no flowers, not even a note in his own words. Just a single folded document. The paper was stiff, official. My eyes moved over the bold type at the top, and for a second the letters did not make sense. Then they did. It was a notice of sale for my house. My house, the place I had lived in for 15 years. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, precise and familiar, but I had never signed it. The closing date was last week. The new owner's name was not anyone I knew, and in the corner, typed without a trace of hesitation, was the line that told me I had 14 days to vacate. I sat down, holding the paper in both hands. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. I could hear the refrigerator hum. The air felt cooler, like someone had opened a window. I read the document again, slower this time, taking in each line. My son had sent me this. On Mother's Day. In a box. No explanation, no call, just a transaction that erased my home from under me. I glanced toward the porch where the light was still pouring in, but it felt different now, distant. I thought of all the mornings I had spent here, brewing tea, reading the news, believing that the walls around me were mine. Now they were not. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes when the worst thing has already been decided without you. It is not the silence before a storm. It is the silence after. The kind where you can almost hear the echo of a door closing, even if it happened miles away. I folded the paper carefully and set it back in the box. My hands were steady, though my chest felt tight. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a truth was taking shape. But I pushed it aside. I knew I would need all my clarity later. For now, I just sat there, letting the reality settle over me like the late morning heat. If you have ever felt the floor shift beneath you without warning, you know how the minutes after can stretch long and strange. You replay the last conversations, the hints you might have missed, the things you would have done differently if you had known. I sat in that space, staring at the box on the table, knowing my life had just changed, and that the person who changed it was my own child. The gulls kept circling overhead. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. The world outside kept moving as if nothing had happened. But inside my walls, inside my life, something had already broken. And though I didn't know it yet, this was only the first crack. The morning after I found the box, I woke before the sun. The paper from the day before was still on the table, right where I had left it. I did not touch it. I made coffee instead, trying to find some comfort in the sound of the pot dripping, but even that familiar rhythm felt off. I had not heard from Austin since the delivery, and I doubted I would anytime soon. By mid-morning, I was going through the small cabinet where I kept important documents. Birth certificates, insurance forms, my will, the deed to the house before it had apparently been sold. I flipped through each folder, checking dates, signatures, anything that might explain how this had happened without my knowledge. That was when I saw it. Tucked between last year's tax return and a letter from the bank was a set of forms I barely remembered signing months ago. At the time, Austin had said it was paperwork to help with property tax filings. I had not read every line. I trusted him. The forms were neatly typed, nothing that stood out at first glance. But when I looked closer, I saw they were a general power of attorney, giving him the authority to act on my behalf in matters related to the property. My own name and signature sat at the bottom in my careful handwriting. I remembered the day he had brought them over, how he had stood in the kitchen making small talk while I signed. I had been distracted, stirring a pot of soup, thinking it was a small favor for my son. The realization settled heavy in my chest. This had not been an accident or a misunderstanding. This was planned. He had the legal means to sell my home because I had put the pen in my own hand and signed where he told me. Later that day, I called my attorney, Margaret Summers. I told her what had happened and read her the notice of sale. There was a pause before she spoke, the kind that tells you the answer is not going to be good. She explained that with the power of attorney in place, the sale was legal unless I could prove fraud or coercion. It would not be simple. Margaret asked me to bring in every document I had. She wanted to see the power of attorney, my past correspondence with Austin, and any evidence that the sale was not in my best interest. I agreed to meet her the next afternoon. That night, I sat with the folders spread out across my dining table. I checked bank statements, utility bills, anything that tied me to this house. Every line felt like a piece of proof of the life I had built here, and every one of them had been erased with a single transaction I had unknowingly allowed. While I sorted, my mind kept going back to the last few months. Austin had been distant, but there had been moments that stood out. A call from him late in the evening, asking if I had received certain letters from the county. A visit where he left abruptly after taking a phone call from someone he called a business partner. At the time, I had thought little of it. Now I could see the threads connecting. There was also the man from that video call months ago, the one Austin had introduced as his financial advisor. Gavin was his name. He had spoken confidently about maximizing assets, moving money where it could grow faster. I had listened politely, not understanding why he was telling me any of it. Now I suspected he had been more involved than I realized. By midnight, I had everything in neat stacks, ready for Margaret. I left the table as it was and went to bed, though sleep did not come quickly. The power of attorney sat on top of the pile, a reminder of how easily trust could be used against you. The next morning, I drove to Margaret's office. Her desk was already clear, except for a yellow legal pad and a fountain pen. She read through the documents without speaking, her eyes moving quickly but carefully. When she finished, she looked at me and said we would need to gather more than just these. She wanted a handwriting analysis of the sale contract, even though it looked like mine. She also wanted to see if there were any financial transfers connected to Austin after the sale. As I left her office, I felt the first trace of direction since opening that box. It was not relief, not yet, but it was a step. I knew there would be more to uncover, and I knew it would not be easy. The house was gone, but the truth was still here, waiting to be found in the paper trail he had left behind. Mother's Day arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that usually makes Charleston feel like a postcard. The streets were quiet, the neighbors' porches draped in flower baskets, and the faint sound of church bells carried on the breeze. I was at the kitchen counter, slicing strawberries for breakfast, when the doorbell rang. There was no knock, no voice calling out, just the short chime, then silence. When I opened the door, I saw a small square box resting neatly on the welcome mat. My name was written in familiar handwriting. I bent down and picked it up. It was light, too light for the kind of gift I had expected. I carried it to the dining table, setting it down beside the plate of fruit. For a moment, I let myself believe it might be something thoughtful. Austin had not been one for flowers in recent years, but perhaps this was different. Perhaps this was an olive branch after the coolness in his voice lately. I sat down, pulled the lid open, and found no ribbon, no card. Just a single sheet of thick paper folded twice. The top line of the document was in bold type. My eyes caught the words, "Notice of Sale," before I had even unfolded the rest. I read the first paragraph slowly, each word pressing heavier than the last. The property listed was my home. The sale price was printed clearly. The buyer's name was unfamiliar. The date of the closing had already passed. I turned to the final page, and there it was. My name, my signature, perfectly replicated, every curve and loop in the right place. I knew instantly it was not my hand that had written it. The more I stared, the more it felt like I was looking at a photograph of my signature rather than the thing itself. At the bottom, there was a clause. I had 14 days to vacate the premises, no appeal, no discussion. The room around me seemed to shift. The light from the window dulled, the steady hum of the refrigerator grew louder, and the air felt heavier. I set the paper down on the table and rested my palms flat on either side. I read it again, trying to find a line that might say this was a mistake, that there was a misunderstanding. It was all final. The transaction was complete. In that moment, the box in front of me was more than cardboard and paper. It was a line drawn cleanly between the life I had known and the life I would have to face. I thought about the mornings on the porch with my tea, the shelves lined with books my husband and I had chosen together, the quilt folded at the foot of my bed. All of it would have to be packed, moved, or left behind. I looked toward the window where the sun was still spilling across the porch floorboards. It was the same light as before, but now it felt different, distant. I could feel the shape of the loss before I had even stood up from the table. I reached for the document again, my fingers tracing the date of sale. It was just a few days after Austin had called to tell me he was busy with the hotel. That call had been short, almost dismissive. Now I could see why. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way I wished they would not. I placed the notice back inside the box, closed the lid, and slid it to the far end of the table. My hands were steady, but inside there was a slow, cold weight settling. I thought of the power of attorney tucked away in my files, the signature I had given without a second thought. This was the outcome of that trust. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I moved from room to room, not packing yet, just looking. The framed photographs, the worn armchair by the window, the side table with a ring in the wood from my coffee cup. Each object felt like it was already slipping away from me. By evening, I sat in the living room with the box on my lap. The shadows stretched long across the floor, and the house was quiet except for the ticking clock. 14 days. That was all the time left here. The word home already felt like it belonged in the past. I did not cry. The tears would come later, but not now. Right now, I needed to remember every detail. The weight of the paper, the shape of the box, the way the sun had fallen across the table when I opened it. These were the things I would carry with me. I set the box back on the table and turned off the light. The house was in darkness, but I knew every corner by heart. Even stripped of ownership, it was still mine in memory, and no notice of sale could take that away. When I lay down that night, the box sat in the next room, small and unremarkable to anyone else. To me, it was the clearest proof of how quickly the ground beneath you could shift, and how easily the people you trust most can be the ones to move it. 2 days after the box arrived, I began packing the first few things things I knew I could carry easily. Not because I was ready to leave, but because the notice made it impossible to pretend there was time to waste. I folded clothes into a small suitcase, the kind I had once used for weekend trips, and set it by the door. Every drawer I opened felt like it carried more than just belongings. It carried the years I had spent here, the quiet routines, and the small details that had made this house mine. By the end of the week, I had moved into a small roadside motel just outside Charleston. The room smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old carpet. The bedspread was rough under my hands, and the thin curtains rattled slightly when the air conditioner switched on. I paid for a week in cash and kept the receipt in my purse. It was the first time in decades that my address was not a place I owned. The first night there, I lay awake listening to the sound of cars passing on the nearby highway. The red numbers on the clock glowed against the dark, and every hour felt longer than the last. I thought about the 14 days, how quickly they were passing, and how each one took me further from the life I had built. Early the next morning, my phone buzzed. A short message from Austin came through. It said he and Cara were moving into her parents' home. Nothing else. No mention of me, of the box, of what he had done. A few hours later, a second message from Cara appeared. She wrote that it would be better if I stayed quiet about the situation, that making it public would not help anyone. I read it twice, my fingers tightening around the phone. I set it down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. I tried to keep my days steady. I went to the small diner across the street for breakfast, ordered coffee and eggs, and sat by the window where I could see the motel parking lot. I kept a notebook in my bag, jotting down small details, the kind that might matter later. Dates, names, amounts. I was careful not to let my mind wander too far into what I had lost. Instead, I focused on what I could gather. In the evening, I walked the block around the motel. The streets were lined with small shops, a gas station, and a thrift store. I found a quiet spot at the end of the block where I could sit on a bench and listen to the sound of traffic fading as the sun went down. Those walks gave me a rhythm again, a way to feel that I still had some control over my days. One night, while sorting through the folder of documents I had brought with me, I noticed a printed email chain I had not paid much attention to before. It was between Austin and someone named Gavin, discussing timelines and transfers. The words were vague enough to seem harmless, but the dates lined up closely with the sale of the house. I set the paper aside and made a note to give it to Margaret. The motel room became a kind of temporary office. Papers were spread across the desk and the bed. My laptop sat open to a spreadsheet I had started to track everything I was learning. It was not much, but it gave me the sense that I was not standing still. One afternoon, I took a bus downtown to meet Margaret. I handed her the email chain and explained how it matched the timeline of the sale. She read it carefully and said it could be useful, but we needed more. She asked if I remembered anyone else who might have been aware of what Austin was doing. I thought about the months before the sale, the calls he took outside my earshot, the names I had overheard but never questioned. I promised her I would think on it. Back at the motel that night, I sat at the small desk with the light on low. I thought about how quickly things had shifted. 1 month I had a home, a set of keys, and a life I recognized. Now I had a single room, a stack of papers, and a clock counting down the days until I had to leave even here. Still, there was something steady under all of it. I was not ready to give up. The motel was temporary. The quiet was temporary. Even the 14-day deadline was only a measure of time, not a measure of what I was capable of doing within it. I closed the folder, set it neatly on the desk, and pulled the curtains closed. The sound of traffic outside was constant, but I let it fade until it was only a background hum. When I lay down, I reminded myself that losing a home was not the same as losing the ground beneath my feet. The walls around me might be different now, but I still knew who I was. And that, more than anything, was something Austin could not sell or take away. 3 nights into my stay at the motel, I opened my laptop and signed into the account for Bay Lantern Holdings. The name would have meant nothing to Austin, but to me it was the structure I had been building quietly for over a year. The room was dim except for the glow of the screen. On the desktop were the scanned contracts from the purchase of Seabright Hospitality, each file labelled by date and phase of the acquisition. I had bought the chain 3 months earlier through the holding company, using the proceeds from the sale of a commercial property I had owned for years, along with a bridge loan. The numbers were precise in my mind. $14.6 million in total, with just over $7 million from the property sale, the rest from investments I had nurtured over decades and that short-term loan. It was the largest transaction I had ever been part of, and no one in my family knew. The purchase agreement was thorough, and the clauses had been negotiated to the letter. Non-disclosure provision meant the previous owners could not speak of the sale until a set date. That date was approaching, but it had not arrived yet. Until then, I was just another shareholder on paper, my identity shielded by the layers of the holding company. I sat back in the chair, looking at the Seabright logo at the top of the documents. Austin thought he was securing his future by buying into the family chain through Kara's side. He had no idea that those shares now reported up to me. That knowledge sat quietly in the center of my mind, steady and solid, something I could hold on to while everything else was shifting. The motel room was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. I opened the financial projections I had commissioned before the acquisition. The chain was profitable, with stable occupancy rates and a strong summer season ahead. The bridge loan would be repaid well within its 2-year term, and after that, the income would be clear. I had plans for that income, plans that went beyond personal comfort. I remembered the weeks leading up to the deal, the meetings with attorneys and accountants, the hours spent reading contracts line by line. There had been moments when I doubted myself, wondering if I was taking on too much at this stage in my life. But each time I reviewed the numbers, the decision felt sound. It was not about risk for risk's sake. It was about control. I clicked through to the correspondence with the operations team. Most of them did not know me yet. They knew the holding company name, but not the woman behind it. That anonymity had been deliberate. I wanted to step into ownership on my own terms, without the noise of family opinion. Closing the laptop, I thought about how the secrecy had worked in my favor. If Austin had known, he might have been more cautious in the choices he made. He might have thought twice before using my signature to take my home. But he had acted without seeing the full picture, and now the full picture belonged to me. The next morning, I took a folder from my bag and spread it across the small table by the window. It contained every piece of paperwork tied to Bay Lantern Holdings, from the initial articles of organization to the final wire confirmations. I reviewed them in order, making notes in the margin about what might become useful if the situation with Austin forced my hand. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I had options. The house was gone, yes, but I was not without resources. The chain was mine in a way that could not be undone by anyone else's pen. And in that fact, there was room to breathe. As the day wore on, I left the motel and walked to a nearby coffee shop with a sturdy wooden counter and large windows facing the street. I brought my notebook and sat in the corner, writing down a timeline of events. From the day Austin brought me the power of attorney forms to the day the box arrived, I listed everything I could recall. The goal was not just to remember, but to see patterns, to understand where his actions had intersected with my own steps toward the acquisition. By the time the sun dipped low, I had filled several pages. The two timelines were moving toward each other, without either of us realizing it at the time. That convergence would matter. It would matter when the truth came into view. Back in the motel room, I set the notebook beside the folder and opened the laptop once more. I pulled up the Seabright site, scrolling through images of the hotels I now owned. Coastal views, polished lobbies, smiling staff. They were the backdrop of Austin's new ambitions, but they were also the quiet proof of my own foresight. I shut the laptop again, feeling the weight of the moment settle evenly. The loss of my home was a wound, but not a defeat. The days ahead would bring their own challenges, but I had a foundation that could hold. And when the time was right, that foundation would be visible to everyone, including the one who thought I had nothing left. 2 days after reviewing the Seabright files, I called Margaret and told her I was ready to bring in more than just the notice of sale and the power of attorney. I gathered a thick envelope from my bag, the kind with a clasp, and placed inside the printed emails, the HUD-1 settlement statement, copies of my bank transactions, and the handwriting samples I had kept over the years. These were not just mementos now. They were evidence. Her office was on the second floor of a restored brick building downtown, with tall windows that let in the early afternoon light. I sat across from her desk as she laid each document out in careful order. She did not rush, and I appreciated that. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic from the street below. Margaret picked up the notice of sale first, running her finger along the lines of text before setting it aside. She moved on to the power of attorney, then the bank records. When she reached the email chain between Austin and Gavin, she read each message twice. Her pen made short notes in the margin of her legal pad, the letters tight and even. She told me we would need more than suspicion to move forward. A handwriting analysis would help, even though the signature on the sale documents looked like mine. It was about showing that the pressure points in the pen strokes did not match, that the rhythm of the writing was off. She also wanted a detailed map of the financial flow, where the sale proceeds went, how quickly they moved, and into whose accounts. I agreed, and she gave me the name of a forensic document examiner she had worked with before. I made the call that evening. The man's voice was steady, professional, and he asked for every sample of my signature I could find from the last 5 years. I promised to have them ready by the time we met. Back at the motel, I opened a box of personal files and pulled out old tax returns, insurance renewals, and letters I had signed. I lined them up on the desk, arranging them by year. The patterns were obvious to me, but I knew a trained eye would see far more: the angle of the letters, the space between words, the pressure on certain strokes. The next day, I met him at a small office near the courthouse. He examined each page under a magnifying lamp, then compared them to the signature on the sale contract. He pointed out places where the line weight shifted unnaturally, where the lift between letters was too clean, almost mechanical. It was enough for him to say with confidence that it had been traced from an earlier document. I left his office with a signed report and returned to Margaret's. She read it carefully and placed it in the center of the growing pile. It was the first solid piece we had, something that was not just my word against Austin's. Maya called that evening. We had met briefly before, during one of my quiet visits to a Seabright property before the acquisition. She was the operations assistant to the general manager, and she had a reputation for noticing details others missed. She told me she had seen unusual expense approvals in recent months, high-value purchases and transfers that had not gone through standard channels, all bearing Austin's authorization. I asked her to send copies if she could. The next morning, an email arrived with a string of invoices and approval forms. Each one had Austin's digital signature and dates that fell just after the house sale. The amounts were large enough to stand out, but structured just under the thresholds that triggered automatic review. Margaret looked over the documents and nodded slowly. This was the second thread we needed. Not only had my signature been used without consent, but the proceeds from that sale had been tied to questionable activity within a company where I held controlling interest. In the following days, I made it a routine. Morning coffee, a walk to clear my mind, then hours with Margaret piecing together the timeline. We matched bank transfers from the escrow account to Austin's personal accounts, then from his accounts into the purchase of Seabright shares. The numbers told a story as clearly as any witness could. The pile of evidence grew until it filled 2 large binders. One was strictly for the signature forgery and property sale. The other was for corporate transactions. Each binder had dividers, dates, and summaries. I wanted to be able to turn to any page and see exactly how we got there. One evening, after Margaret left to attend another meeting, I stayed in her office alone with the binders. I flipped through page after page, not reading every line but letting the weight of it sink in. This was more than a fight over a house. It was about trust used as leverage, about the quiet ways someone could dismantle a life if they thought you were not watching. As I locked the binders back in the cabinet, I knew the next step would not be about gathering. It would be about using what we had. The evidence was there. The challenge would be in deciding when and how to place it in the open so that it could not be ignored or explained away. Walking back to the motel, I felt the air shift cooler as the sun dropped behind the buildings. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, and I realized I no longer felt the same heaviness that had followed me from the day the box arrived. I had direction now, and that direction was lined with facts, not just feelings. It would be enough to carry into whatever came next. The email from the Seabright corporate office arrived on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was short and formal, announcing the quarterly operations meeting for all regional managers and major shareholders. The location was the downtown conference center, one I knew well from past business events. I read through the agenda twice. Financial performance review, upcoming expansion plans, and a section at the end marked Shareholder Address. That was the opening I needed. I forwarded the email to Margaret with a brief note. She called me an hour later, her voice calm but firm. She told me this was the perfect venue. Every key player would be in the same room, including Austin, Cara, and her parents. There would be no avoiding the truth once it was on record. We agreed to keep the plan quiet until the moment arrived. The days leading up to the meeting were steady but tense. I stayed at the motel, keeping my focus on the binders we had assembled. Every evening I went through them again, committing the key details to memory. I did not want to fumble when the time came. This would not be a confrontation built on emotion alone. It would be grounded in documented fact. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed in a navy suit I had kept from my years in real estate. It was tailored but simple, the kind of clothing that spoke without raising its voice. I placed the smaller of the two binders into my leather briefcase, the one containing the most relevant documents, the purchase agreement for Seabright, the proof of my controlling interest, and the report on Austin's forged signature and financial transfers. The conference center lobby was bright with polished marble floors and high glass walls that let in the winter light. Staff in crisp uniforms directed attendees toward the main hall. I walked past small clusters of people greeting each other, their voices low but animated. My name was not yet on their tongues, and I preferred it that way. Inside, rows of chairs faced a long stage where the Seabright banner hung behind a polished wood podium. The seats near the front were reserved for executives and shareholders. I took a place in the second row, where I could see everything without being at the center of attention. Austin arrived 10 minutes later, wearing a tailored grey suit and a smile meant for the crowd. Kara walked beside him, her parents just a step behind. They moved as a unit, shaking hands, nodding to familiar faces. Austin glanced briefly in my direction, then away. Whether he had not recognized me immediately or chose not to acknowledge me, I could not tell. The meeting began with the CEO presenting quarterly earnings. Charts and graphs lit up the screen behind him, showing strong performance across the board. Plans for a new coastal property were met with polite applause. The atmosphere in the room was one of confidence and momentum. As the agenda moved forward, I watched Austin lean toward Kara, whispering occasionally. His posture was relaxed, his expression self-assured. He believed he was part of the driving force behind these numbers, and in a way, he was, just not in the way he imagined. When the final segment began, the CEO announced the shareholder address. He said a controlling shareholder had requested to speak directly to the group. My name was called. A few heads turned, some with recognition, others with surprise. I rose from my seat, my briefcase in hand, and walked to the podium. The room quieted as I placed the binder on the stand and opened it to the first page. I spoke plainly, starting with the date of my acquisition of Seabright Hospitality through Bay Lantern Holdings. I outlined the terms of the purchase, the confidentiality clause, and the upcoming expiration of that clause. I did not rush, allowing each fact to settle before moving to the next. Then I turned to the second section of the binder. I described the sale of my home, the forged signature confirmed by a forensic examiner, and the direct trail of funds from that sale into the purchase of Seabright shares by Austin. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The documents did the work for me. A murmur spread through the room. I continued, noting the irregular expense approvals identified by the operations team and how they connected to Austin's accounts. Each point was matched with a page number and a document in the binder, which I held open for the board members seated nearby to see. Austin's expression shifted slowly. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a tightness around his mouth. Kara's parents looked between us, their eyes narrowing as they began to piece together the meaning behind my words. I concluded by stating my expectations. All questionable transactions would be reviewed by an independent auditor. Any shareholder, regardless of family connection, found to have engaged in misconduct would face the consequences outlined in the corporate bylaws. I closed the binder and stepped back from the podium. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the projector. Then the CEO thanked me and announced a brief recess before the board convened in private session. I walked back to my seat without looking directly at Austin. The binder was back in my hands, the clasp secure. Around me, conversations had already begun in low voices, people leaning toward each other to confirm what they had just heard. As I left the hall for the lobby, I felt the air shift. This was not a resolution yet, but it was the turning point. The facts were no longer confined to my motel room or Margaret's office. They were in the open, in a place where they could not be dismissed or ignored. I stepped outside into the cool air, the winter light still bright on the pavement. The path ahead would have its share of resistance, but the direction was set. The silence I had carried since the day the box arrived was broken, and in its place was something steadier, the weight of the truth, out where it belonged. The morning after the shareholders' meeting, I woke before the sun. The motel room was still and dim, the only sound the steady hum of the air conditioner. My briefcase sat on the small table by the window, the binder inside just as I had left it after walking out of the conference hall. The day before had been deliberate, measured, and public. Today would be different. Today was about tightening the net. I called Margaret shortly after 7. She answered on the first ring. I told her that the moment to move forward had come. The board had the documents, the room had seen the evidence, and now it was time to make sure no detail could be buried in quiet committees. She agreed, her tone even but carrying the edge of momentum. We set a time to meet in her office by mid-morning. When I arrived, she had already spread the binders across her desk. 2 legal pads lay side by side, each headed with a list. One was marked property, the other corporate. Under each heading were the steps we needed to take in order. For the property, it was the fraud claim, the civil action for damages, and the filing for restitution. For the corporate side, it was the request for a full audit, the motion to suspend voting rights for implicated shareholders, and the formal demand for reimbursement of misappropriated funds. We began with the property case. Margaret drafted the initial filing, attaching the forensic handwriting report, the original sale documents, and a sworn affidavit from me. Each exhibit was labelled and cross-referenced. It was not just about the house anymore. It was about establishing a clear, documented act of forgery, one that tied directly into the second case. For the corporate side, we prepared a submission to the board's governance committee. It included the irregular expense approvals, the bank transfer records, and the matching timeline of the property sale and Seabright's share purchase. Each page was marked with dates and amounts, the figures leaving no room for interpretation. Margaret reminded me that corporations liked clarity, and numbers had a way of cutting through sentiment. By noon, both packets were complete. Margaret arranged for the property case to be filed with the clerk that afternoon. The corporate submission would be delivered by hand to the board chair. She looked at me across the desk and said this was the point where the process could begin to move on its own, fueled by the structure of the systems we were now inside. I left her office and walked the few blocks to the bank where I had held my accounts for over 20 years. The branch manager, an older man named Howard, greeted me by name. I asked to review every transaction connected to the escrow account from the house sale. He led me to a private desk and printed a complete statement. I went through it line by line, marking the transfers that matched the documents in Margaret's binder. The figures were exact. The path of the money was as straight as a ruled line, from the sale to Austin's account, then out into the corporate purchase. Howard signed a statement verifying the accuracy of the records and gave me the originals. I slipped them into my briefcase, feeling the weight of the file grow heavier. That evening, back at the motel, I spread the day's work across the bed. The neat stacks of paper, each marked and labelled, were tangible proof of the shift from reaction to action. For weeks, I had been gathering, tracing, and connecting. Now each piece had a place in a structure that could stand in a courtroom or a boardroom. I thought about Austin then, not as my son, but as a man who had made a series of calculated choices. Choices that assumed my silence, my inaction. He had moved in a way that suggested he believed there would be no consequence beyond my quiet departure from the house. That belief had been the foundation under his every move. Yesterday's meeting had cracked it. Today's filings were beginning to dismantle it completely. The phone rang just after 9. It was Margaret. She told me the clerk had stamped the property case and assigned it a number. The corporate submission had been delivered, and the board chair had confirmed receipt. The audit request would be on the agenda for their next closed session. It was moving. After we hung up, I sat at the small desk by the window, looking out at the parking lot below. The neon sign for the motel flickered softly, the light washing over the asphalt in uneven waves. I thought about the day I had carried the box into my kitchen, the paper inside it, and the space it had carved out in my life. That space was no longer empty. It was being filled, piece by piece, with the work of taking back what had been taken. I gathered the papers into the briefcase again and closed the latch. The room felt quieter, but not in the hollow way it had before. This was the quiet of a plan in motion, of knowing that the next steps were already set, and that each one would bring me closer to the point where this chapter could close. The binder rested against the side of the case, its edges worn slightly from weeks of use. It was no longer just a record. It was the map, and I knew every path it held. The coming days would bring resistance, but the foundation was firm. And for the first time since the box arrived, I felt the solid shape of forward movement, not just in my thoughts, but in the very structure of the life I was building back. 3 days after the filings, the first sign of reaction came quietly. Margaret called to tell me that the Seabright board had approved the independent audit. It would begin within a week, led by a firm with no prior connection to the company. Their scope would cover every transaction in the past 18 months. She said it without embellishment, but I could hear the undercurrent. This was not routine. This was scrutiny. That same afternoon, I received a short letter in a plain envelope slid under the door of my motel room. It was from Austin. His handwriting was hurried, the lines uneven. He wrote that the board had overreacted, that there were explanations for the transfers, and that taking this path would damage more than it would fix. He did not use the word apology, nor did he acknowledge the forged signature. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of the binder. Words without accountability were not worth more than the paper they were written on. The next morning, I met Margaret at a cafe near the courthouse. She had a fresh set of documents for me to review, a subpoena for records from Austin's bank, and a request for communications between him and Gavin during the period in question. Each page was precise, stripped of anything unnecessary. She explained that once served, the bank would have 10 business days to comply. That timeline aligned with the start of the corporate audit. 2 streams of inquiry, moving in parallel. By midweek, the subpoena had been delivered. The process server confirmed Austin had accepted it without comment. Gavin, however, was less cooperative, instructing his office to route all communications through his attorney. Margaret expected that, and she had already prepared the formal request through the court. I kept my days ordered. Mornings began with coffee at the small table in the motel room, followed by hours of reviewing and annotating the binders. I wanted to be able to answer any question without hesitation. Afternoons were for meetings with Margaret, or quiet walks through the nearby streets, clearing my mind enough to return to the details in the evening. On Thursday, an email arrived from Maya. She had been watching the internal communications at Seabright closely. Attached to her message was a memo from the board chair to the senior management team. It stated that until the audit was complete, all discretionary spending approvals above a modest threshold would require dual sign-off. It was a subtle shift, but I knew its impact. It meant Austin could no longer move funds with a single click. That evening, I sat with the memo printed and placed at the front of the corporate binder. It was not the final step, but it was movement in the right direction. Each restriction was a reminder that his influence was not as secure as he had assumed. Friday brought another change. The clerk's office called to confirm a preliminary hearing date for the property case. It was set for early next month. That gave us time to finalize exhibits, prepare witness lists, and refine the timeline. Margaret believed the forensic report alone would be enough to secure the case, but we agreed to build it so that every piece could stand independently if challenged. The days were steady, but not without their moments of tension. Late one evening, as I returned to the motel, a car slowed near the entrance. I recognized it as Austin's. He did not get out. The window lowered slightly, but no words were exchanged. He drove off a moment later. I stood in the cool air, watching the taillights disappear. It was not confrontation, but it was a signal that he was aware of the ground shifting beneath him. Back inside, I sat on the edge of the bed with my briefcase beside me. I thought about how far this had moved from the day the box arrived. Back then, the loss had been sudden and unmoored. Now there was a structure to every step. The filings, the audit, the restrictions, each was part of a deliberate progression. The week ended with a meeting at Margaret's office. We went through the checklist on the legal pad, marking each completed task. Property case filed, corporate audit approved, subpoenas served, preliminary hearings scheduled. The list still had open lines, but the completed ones formed a clear path. As I left her office, the sun was low over the city, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. The streets were quieter than usual, the air holding that stillness that comes just before dusk. I walked back to the motel without rushing. The pace felt right, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. In the room, I placed the binders on the table side by side. They were heavier now, not just in paper but in what they represented. The facts were no longer fragments. They were connected, aligned, and ready to stand in whatever room they were needed. I closed the curtains and let the room fall into the muted light of evening. This was not the end, but it was the point where the direction was certain. The silence that had followed the day of the box was gone. In its place was the weight of progress, and the quiet knowledge that step by step, the truth was closing the distance. The first week of the audit passed quietly on the surface, but I could feel the undercurrent. Maya's updates came in short, carefully worded messages. The audit team had begun with transaction histories from all regional offices, pulling expense approvals, vendor payments, and capital allocations. They worked methodically, cross-referencing each figure against original invoices. It was the kind of work that left no corner untouched. On Tuesday morning, Margaret called to tell me the bank had complied with the subpoena. The packet she received contained months of statements from Austin's personal and business accounts. She described the way the transfers lined up almost perfectly with the property sale timeline. The amounts were precise and deliberate, each just under reporting thresholds, but together they formed an unmistakable chain. She said the audit team would find the same thing from their side, but now we had it from the bank itself. That afternoon, I walked to her office to see the records in person. She had arranged them chronologically on her desk, each page marked with tabs. I followed the flow from one statement to the next. The path was as we had suspected: sale proceeds into Austin's account, partial withdrawals, purchases of Seabright shares, and layered transfers to accounts tied to Gavin's consultancy. It was a pattern that, once seen, could not be explained away as coincidence. Margaret said she would send certified copies to the property case file and the corporate board. This was no longer just about internal governance. The findings had potential to trigger regulatory interest, and that was a step Austin could not control. By midweek, the board chair requested a special session for major shareholders. The notice was formal, citing the ongoing audit and recent developments requiring immediate discussion. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon in the same conference centre where I had spoken before. On Friday, I arrived early. The air in the lobby was cooler than usual, the chatter lower, more restrained. When the doors to the meeting room opened, I took a seat near the front. The board chair began promptly, outlining the scope of the session. He confirmed that preliminary audit findings showed irregularities in expense approvals and share purchases, all within the period tied to the property sale in my case. He spoke plainly without speculation, and then opened the floor for questions from the board. Austin sat 3 seats down from the end of the table, his posture rigid. He did not speak at first, letting others ask about timelines, about thresholds, about oversight failures. When he did speak, it was measured, offering partial explanations that skirted the core of the findings. He cited market opportunities, operational necessities, and strategic alignment. None of it addressed the source of the funds or the forged signature. The board chair listened without interruption, then returned to the facts. He stated that under corporate bylaws, any shareholder found to have engaged in misconduct affecting company assets could face suspension of voting rights and, in severe cases, forced divestment. He reminded the room that the audit was ongoing, but the current evidence warranted temporary measures. A motion was made to suspend Austin's voting rights until the audit concluded. The vote was taken without delay. The result was decisive. The motion passed. The chair instructed the secretary to record the suspension, effective immediately. Austin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Kara's parents exchanged glances, their expressions caught between disbelief and calculation. The meeting continued briefly to outline the next steps for the audit, then adjourned. I left the room with Margaret walking beside me. She said the suspension was significant. It meant Austin could no longer influence board decisions in the weeks ahead. More importantly, it signaled to the audit team and to outside observers that the board was willing to act on the evidence. That evening, back at the motel, I set my briefcase on the desk and opened it slowly. Inside were the same binders, but their contents had shifted in weight. They were no longer just preparation. They were becoming the backbone of actions that had already started to reshape the situation. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the headlights pass on the road below. The distance from the day the box arrived to this moment felt measured in more than weeks. It was measured in the steady erosion of assumptions, in the narrowing of the space Austin had once moved through without question. Before turning in for the night, I placed the letter he had sent me earlier in the week into the back pocket of the binder. It belonged there, not as evidence in the formal sense, but as a reminder of what had been offered in place of accountability. It was light compared to the certified bank records, the audit memos, and the board resolutions, but it was part of the story all the same. The next morning would bring its own work. There were still hearings ahead, still findings to be finalized, still the slow process of putting each part of the case into its final form. But for now, the structure was holding. The truth had moved from the edges into the center, and it was no longer mine alone to carry. The days after the board meeting moved with a quieter intensity. The audit team was deep in their review, and Margaret was working with precision to prepare for the property hearing. My role now was to keep pace with both, making sure no detail went unaddressed. Each morning I cleared the small motel table, laid out my notes, and cross-checked every date and figure. The binder was no longer just a record, it was the structure holding everything in place. By midweek, Margaret called to confirm that the hearing schedule had been set in stone. She explained how the process would unfold. The judge would hear the forgery claim first, followed by arguments for damages. The forensic report, the bank records, and my affidavit would be entered as primary exhibits. She wanted me to review each piece one more time, not to memorize every word, but to be comfortable speaking to any of it if called. I walked to her office the next morning. The binders were waiting on her desk, open to the most critical sections. We went through them steadily, her questions direct and her notes sharp. When she closed the last page, she said the case was strong and the timeline was clear. It was exactly what we needed, straightforward, supported by evidence, and impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding. That afternoon, Maya sent a short update from the Seabright offices. The audit had uncovered several vendor contracts approved without competitive bidding. The amounts were substantial, and the same names appeared on Austin's bank statements. It was not yet conclusive, but the overlap was enough to keep the audit team focused on those threads. Margaret advised that this information might find its way into the hearing if it could be tied directly to the house sale proceeds. In the evenings, I kept my routine simple. A walk around the block, a light meal, and then time at the desk, organizing the next day's priorities. I had learned that keeping my space in order helped keep my mind in order too. The motel room, once just a stopgap, had become a place where the plan could live without distraction. 2 days before the hearing, I met Margaret again. She had a slim folder separate from the binders. Inside were the exhibits exactly as they would be presented in court. Each page was numbered, each reference aligned with my affidavit. She explained the sequence: my testimony, the expert report, the bank verification, and finally the timeline. We rehearsed my part until the rhythm felt steady. The night before the hearing, I slept lightly but without restlessness. The morning came early, and I dressed in the same navy suit I had worn to the board meeting. The courthouse was a short drive from the motel, but I arrived early, preferring to sit in the quiet hallway outside the courtroom. Margaret arrived soon after, her presence calm and grounding. When the hearing began, the judge listened without interruption as Margaret outlined the case. She spoke plainly, focusing on the forged signature, the chain of funds, and the direct connection to Austin. The forensic examiner's report was entered without objection. The bank records followed, their dates and amounts matching the timeline exactly. Austin's attorney argued briefly, suggesting that any irregularities were administrative and that my consent had been implied. The judge asked for documentation of that consent. None was produced. The contrast between the structured evidence in our exhibits and the absence of their supporting proof was clear. By midday, the judge announced that the matter would proceed to a full trial for damages, but that the property claim itself was upheld. It was a decisive moment. The forgery was recognized, the sale acknowledged as invalid in its execution. The path to restitution was open. Walking out of the courthouse, the winter air felt sharper, cleaner. Margaret and I spoke briefly on the steps, agreeing to meet the next day to prepare for the damages phase. There was still work ahead, but the foundation was now in place. Back at the motel, I placed the new court order in the front of the property binder. It was the first official acknowledgement of what I had known since the day I opened the box. It was not the end, but it was the point where the weight of proof had shifted from my shoulders to the formal record. The silence that had once been filled with loss was now filled with the steady hum of progress, and I could feel that each step was carrying me closer to the point where this chapter would close on my own terms. 2 weeks after the hearing, the audit report was finalized. Margaret called me to her office on a bright but cold morning. The document was thick, bound in a plain cover, and heavy in my hands. Page after page confirmed what we had suspected. The funds from my home's sale had been used to buy Seabright shares through layered transfers, and the irregular vendor contracts were tied directly to accounts connected to Austin and Gavin. It was not just circumstantial, it was a pattern, deliberate and repeated. The board acted quickly. In a closed session, they voted to begin proceedings for forced divestment of Austin's shares under the misconduct clause in the bylaws. His remaining positions within the company were dissolved. The motion passed with little discussion, the evidence too solid to ignore. That same week, the damages phase of the property case concluded. The court awarded full restitution of the property's value, plus legal fees and an additional sum for the fraudulent use of my signature. It would not return the years in that house, but it was a clear acknowledgement that what had been done was wrong and unlawful. Margaret and I met once more to close out the paperwork. She slid the final orders across her desk, her expression steady but warm. She told me that while these outcomes were rare in their clarity, they had been earned by preparation and patience. I thanked her, knowing that without her careful hand, the weight of the process might have worn me down before reaching this point. When I returned to the motel that evening, I placed both the audit report and the court order into the front sections of their respective binders. I closed the covers slowly, feeling the shift in their meaning. They were no longer the tools of a fight still in motion. They were the record of something completed, something resolved on the terms I had chosen. The next morning I packed my suitcase. The motel room, with its thin curtains and steady hum of the air conditioner, had been both a shelter and a base of operations. Now it was just a room again. I left the key at the front desk and stepped out into the cold air, the sun sharp on the pavement. I drove to the coast, to a small property I had purchased quietly months before. It was modest but solid, with a view of the water and enough space for the life I wanted to build now. The furniture was simple, the rooms filled with light. It was not the same as the house I had lost, but it was mine entirely, and that was enough. Standing at the window that first evening, I watched the tide move in slow and certain rhythm. The past months had been a steady climb through shadow and doubt, but here there was room to breathe. I had not needed to shout to be heard, only to stand steady until the truth spoke for itself. The box that had started it all was gone, the paper inside it replaced by a story written in evidence, in dates, and in decisions made with care. It would not be forgotten, but it no longer defined the space around me. What remained was quieter, stronger, and entirely my own. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on how strength often grows in the quietest places. Sometimes the most powerful victories are not loud or public, but the ones you carry within yourself, knowing you stood your ground. Share your own moments of quiet resilience in the comments, or let this story be a reminder that no matter how much is taken from you, there is always a way to rebuild on your own terms. Your story matters, and you never know who might find strength in hearing it.